My name is Mara Ellison, and I'm known professionally, clinically, almost cruelly for being unshakable. In rooms where men twice my age fumble their words and sweat through their tailored suits, I have built a reputation on precision. I do not cry at work. I do not stammer. I do not make emotional decisions. I certainly do not spiral in executive restrooms with my palm pressed to my abdomen, as if I am waiting for it to pulse back a verdict. And yet that morning, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the scent of industrial cleaner sharp in my nose, I stood frozen in front of the mirror and felt something inside me tilt irrevocably off axis. 3 weeks earlier, I had signed the divorce papers that severed my 8-year marriage to Daniel Hart. 2 weeks earlier, after too much wine and a conversation that reopened wounds neither of us had properly stitched closed, I had gone home with him. 1 week earlier, I had promised myself that the lapse was nothing more than nostalgia and loneliness disguised as chemistry. And that morning, with my presentation cued on a tablet in the conference room down the hall, and $30 million in potential contracts waiting on my composure, I realized my period was 10 days late. Daniel had always accused me of loving control more than I loved him. He said it softly at first, like a confession, then later like an indictment. He was a documentary photographer, impulsive, observant, endlessly chasing stories in places I preferred to avoid. Where I saw risk, he saw texture. Where I built spreadsheets, he built narratives. We used to tell people our differences made us stronger, that my structure gave his chaos a home and his spontaneity gave my order warmth. But the truth was less romantic and more corrosive. He resented the hours I poured into climbing the corporate ladder at Halstead and Rowe. I resented the unpredictability of his assignments, the months he'd vanish into remote regions with limited reception, returning sunburned and restless and somehow disappointed that I hadn't learned to want what he wanted while he was gone. We loved each other fiercely once. That part was never a lie. But love without alignment is like building a house on sand. Eventually the foundation shifts and no one can pretend the cracks are decorative. The divorce itself had been eerily civil. No screaming, no slam doors, no theatrics. Just two exhausted adults sitting across from each other in a lawyer's office, dividing assets and memories with the same careful detachment. He kept the loft downtown because it doubled as his studio. I kept the house in Oak Ridge because it was close to my office and already wired with the security system I liked. We split the savings, the furniture, even the books with a methodical fairness that would have impressed any mediator. But what we didn't divide cleanly was the muscle memory of each other, the way my body still recognized his touch without hesitation, the way his voice still found the exact frequency that made my resolve flicker. That night, 2 weeks after signing the papers, when he came over to collect the last of his camera equipment, and we ended up sitting on the kitchen floor sharing a bottle of Cabernet like we used to, it felt less like a mistake and more like slipping into a language we both still spoke fluently. We told ourselves it was closure. We told ourselves it was goodbye. We did not discuss contraception. We did not discuss consequences. We were too busy pretending the ache in our chests was nostalgia instead of warning. I delivered the board presentation that morning without missing a beat. I spoke about growth projections, about strategic partnerships, about risk mitigation with the same crisp cadence that had earned me 2 promotions in 4 years. If anyone noticed that my hands trembled slightly when I clicked to the final slide, they were too polite to mention it. I even fielded questions with my usual composed efficiency, deflecting a particularly aggressive query from one of the senior partners with a statistic I had memorized months ago. When it was over, there was applause, firm handshakes, murmurs of approval. I smiled, thanked them, accepted the praise like I always did. And all the while, a small, insistent voice in the back of my mind kept counting days, recalculating timelines, replaying that night on the kitchen floor with brutal clarity. By the time I returned to my office and closed the door, the applause had faded into something hollow and distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. I bought the pregnancy test on my way home, choosing a pharmacy 3 neighborhoods away so I wouldn't risk seeing anyone I knew. The teenage cashier barely looked at me as she scanned the box, her nails painted a chipped lavender, her expression bored. I wondered if she could sense the tectonic shift occurring behind my carefully neutral face. I wondered if, at her age, I would have handled this differently, if I would have panicked more or less, or in louder ways. I drove home in silence, radio off, the box sitting in the passenger seat like an accusation. The house felt too large when I stepped inside, too quiet without Daniel's half-finished projects scattered across the counters. I left the lights off as I walked to the bathroom, as if darkness could buffer me from the result. The 2 pink lines appeared almost instantly. I had expected a wait, a suspenseful minute or two of uncertainty. Instead, the answer was decisive, unapologetic. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at it until my vision blurred. Not because I was crying, though tears did eventually gather, but because my brain seemed unwilling to process what my eyes were telling it. Pregnant, a word that had hovered abstractly around our marriage for years, sometimes discussed, often deferred. Daniel had wanted children sooner. I had insisted on waiting until I made partner. We had argued about timing, about priorities, about whether ambition and parenthood could coexist without one cannibalizing the other. In the end, we had postponed the conversation so many times that it became one more silent fault line beneath us. And now, after the divorce, after the signatures and the polite goodbyes, the universe had chosen a moment so wildly inconvenient it bordered on irony. My first instinct was not joy or despair, it was calculation. I found myself mentally reviewing my current projects. The upcoming merger negotiations, the likelihood of securing the Chicago expansion account. I considered maternity leave policies, insurance coverage, timelines. I hated that my brain defaulted to logistics before emotion, hated that even in this moment my reflex was to strategize. But beneath the spreadsheets forming in my head, there was something softer stirring, something fragile and electric. A life, cells dividing with quiet determination. A future that did not care about boardrooms or quarterly earnings. The realization made my throat tighten in a way no professional setback ever had. Telling Daniel was the part I dreaded most, not because I feared his anger, but because I feared his hope. He had always wanted to be a father with a kind of open, unguarded longing that both moved and unsettled me. I could already picture the way his eyes would widen, the way his entire posture would shift from weary ex-husband to something brighter and more vulnerable. I wasn't sure I could withstand that shift without unraveling. And yet, not telling him was not an option. This was not solely my life being altered. This was ours, whether we liked it or not. I called him the next evening, after spending an entire day oscillating between denial and fierce protective resolve. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. And for a moment I almost lost my nerve. We made awkward small talk about work, about the unseasonably warm weather, about nothing of consequence. Finally, I interrupted myself and said his name in the tone I used when something mattered. There was a pause, a subtle change in his breathing. I told him I needed to see him in person. He didn't press for details. He just said he'd be there in 20 minutes. When he walked through the front door, he looked the same and not the same. Thinner, maybe. Or perhaps it was just the absence of the invisible thread that had once tied us together daily. We stood facing each other in the living room like diplomats negotiating a fragile treaty. I did not ease into it. I did not soften the edges. I simply told him, I'm pregnant. The words hung between us, heavy and luminous. For a heartbeat, he didn't react at all. Then I saw it, the widening of his eyes, the sharp inhale, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. Hope, just as I had feared, but also something steadier. Awe. He crossed the room slowly, as if approaching something sacred, and stopped a careful distance away from me. Are you sure? He asked, not skeptically but reverently. I nodded. I told him about the test, about the doctor's appointment I had already scheduled to confirm. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I knew intimately, and let out a breath that sounded half like laughter, half like disbelief. Mara, he said, my name thick with emotion. I don't even know what this is. Neither did I. That was the most honest answer available. What surprised me most was not his excitement, but his restraint. He did not assume. He did not say this meant we would reconcile or that fate had intervened to fix us. Instead, he asked what I wanted. The question landed harder than any declaration would have. What did I want? For years I had defined myself by goals and milestones, by achievements that could be measured and displayed. Wanting a child had always been a theoretical future tense, something to slot neatly into a 5-year plan. Now it was immediate, undeniable. And when I searched myself for the truth, past the fear and the disruption and the meticulous planning, I found it there. I wanted this baby. Not as a solution to our failed marriage, not as a symbol, but as its own, separate, miraculous possibility. Daniel nodded when I told him. There were tears in his eyes, and seeing them did not weaken me the way I expected. Instead, it steadied me. We began to talk then, not about getting back together, not about rewriting history, but about logistics and co-parenting and doctor visits. About how we would tell our families. About how we would protect this small, forming life from the unresolved debris of our past. The conversation was imperfect and halting and at times painfully honest. We acknowledged the reasons we had divorced. We did not pretend they had evaporated overnight. But we also recognized that this child did not deserve to be born into bitterness or pride. In the weeks that followed, my body began to change in subtle, humbling ways. Fatigue settled into my bones. Scents that once went unnoticed now turned my stomach. I found myself resting a hand over my abdomen absent-mindedly during meetings, a private gesture of reassurance. At work I maintained my composure, though I confided in my closest colleague after the first trimester passed. Her reaction was immediate and exuberant, a stark contrast to my measured calm. "Mara, this is incredible," she said, pulling me into a hug I would normally dodge. For once, I didn't resist. I was beginning to understand that strength did not always mean stoicism. Sometimes it meant allowing yourself to be altered. Daniel attended the first ultrasound with a quiet attentiveness that surprised me. When the faint, rapid heartbeat filled the room, a sound like distant galloping, something inside both of us cracked open. I glanced at him and saw tears sliding unashamedly down his face. My own vision blurred, and this time I did not fight it. The technician smiled knowingly, accustomed to these reactions, but for us it felt singular and seismic. That sound was proof. Proof that despite our missteps and misalignments, we had created something undeniably real. We did not rush back into romance. In fact, we were almost overly cautious, wary of mistaking proximity for resolution. There were still differences between us, my need for predictability, his hunger for movement. But slowly, in the margins of doctor appointments and nursery planning, we began to rediscover each other not as spouses bound by expectation, but as two flawed people choosing, deliberately, to show up. We talked more honestly than we ever had during our marriage. We admitted fears without weaponizing them. We listened without drafting rebuttals. By the time my belly began to show unmistakably, I no longer saw the pregnancy as an interruption to my carefully constructed life. It was a recalibration. I negotiated a modified workload with a clarity that startled even me, refusing to apologize for boundaries I once would have viewed as weakness. And Daniel, true to form, turned down a months-long overseas assignment, opting instead for local projects that kept him close. Neither of us framed these decisions as sacrifices. They were choices conscious, mutual, rooted in something larger than ego. One evening, as we assembled a crib in the room that used to be my home office, Daniel paused mid-screw and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, gentle, unguarded. "We were so busy trying to win against each other," he said quietly, "that we forgot we were on the same side." The admission did not erase the past, but it reframed it. I realized then that perhaps control had never truly been my strength. Adaptation was. The ability to confront the unexpected and build something new from it. This child had not fixed us, but it had forced us to grow in ways comfort never did. On the night our daughter was born, after hours of labor that stripped me of every illusion of invincibility, Daniel held my hand with unwavering steadiness. When her cry pierced the air, raw and indignant and gloriously alive, I felt a rush of emotion so fierce it eclipsed every boardroom victory I had ever known. They placed her on my chest, warm and impossibly small, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of her breathing. In that moment, titles and timelines and carefully curated reputations dissolved. I was not unshakable. I was not strategic. I was simply her mother. Later, as dawn filtered through the hospital window much like it had that morning in the executive bathroom months ago, I caught my reflection again, hair damp with sweat, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, face softer than I remembered. I did not look composed. I did not look controlled. I looked changed. And for the first time, that did not frighten me. Because strength, I was learning, was not about resisting upheaval. It was about standing in the center of it and choosing love anyway.